Hello, and welcome to our next installment of the 8K Peters Visualization Series book chat with the Golden Age of Visualization.
I don't have it with me this time, so I'm just going to do this with my hands.
Okay,
And we have
I
author
do.
Kim Marriott here. So we have
There you go.
two out
Although
of
I reread
three
it
as
in
physical
preparation for
books.
this. Yeah.
So, Kim, so many congratulations on getting this Magnum Opus out the door. This is a pretty incredible book that many of our books, they stretch over years, maybe decades, but yours centers not, it's like centuries, it's millennia. It's got this incredible scope. What made you decide to write a book with this level of reach?
Thank you, Tamara. Look, so I've been a researcher in data visualization for 20 or 30 years, and I was always interested in the history. And also, why has there been such a dramatic increase in the use of computer visualization over the time I've been working in the area? Um, and so I started to write it because I wanted to put a little bit about the history of data visualization in the data visualization course I was teaching. But then I just became fascinated with it, and you know, started in the 19th century, but then just kept going backwards and backwards and backwards because the origins, are much further back than that, 30,000 years ago or something like that. And so when I started, I didn't realize it was going to take 12 years and a huge amount of work to actually go and find out all about the background. But yeah, it was incredibly exciting, incredibly interesting.
The book was incredibly exciting to me because one of the things that surprised me the most is how encompassing your definition of what data visualization is in the book which really resonated with me because I completely agree with you. It's like previous histories of data visualization tend to have a very narrow focus on what happened beginning around the 18th or 19th century on, right? But you take a much broader approach to the field. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Thanks, Alberto. I'm glad you like that because that was something that worried me because I mean, often data visualization is almost understood to be statistical uh, data visualization, and its origins are much broader than that. It include, when we think about data or information, that can be spatial data. It can be also just cosmological data or uh, understandings of the way the universe works or how people of different cultures understand the universe to work. So, yeah, I deliberately tried to make it a very broad definition because I think it's very hard to define what data visualization is. And it's really just about visual thinking and graphics that have a meaning and are intended to be used to help cognition.
I like the breadth of that definition. And for me, one of the things that stood out was the breadth and depth of the book. I had thought of myself as informed in these things, and then reading your book, I'm like, oh, the universe is bigger than I had appreciated it, right? So I feel like there's what people call the usual suspects, and then I feel like your book dug in about two levels deeper than that. So it was, I mean, particularly the stuff about like the cosmology and the different cultures having these visual mnemonic devices for aiding memory, and you had these kind of amazing set of photos and examples, and not just one but many, and all kinds of cultures. So I knew a little bit about the South Pacific stuff. I knew relatively little about the stuff from indigenous cultures in Australia, and like the sand paintings as a way of actively communicating information. And I particularly loved your characterization of, and we have the equivalent of the cave paintings in Lascaux, but here in Australia, it's a living oral tradition, and we can find out more about what's actually going on. And making that connection, I thought was fantastic.
Yeah, look, I've found that incredibly interesting. I guess that was one of my favorite chapters, that chapter looking really at those origins and how traditional societies use graphics. And particularly, I learned an enormous amount researching that.
And it also makes the book, I would say, much less Western centric than other histories. of visualization that are still very valuable. I'm not trying to dismiss them in any way. I'm thinking about, Michael Friendly's work and things like that. Yours is a little bit, I would say, a little bit more diverse in the examples that you provide. Something that I was going to add, by the way, and perhaps I'm going to ask you to expand a little bit on it, is that you mentioned a book that I read many years ago, The Domain of Images by James Elkins,
Oh, yes.
which is a book that I believe that more visualization designers should read. Can you talk a little bit about how that book inspired you and in what ways? The notion of notation versus images and things like that.
Look, one of the things I loved about researching this book was I I had a very traditional view of data visualization when I started, and then um, I realized that we really have to think about, the reasons for data visualization. It's not just inventing notations and who invented the notation or whatever. It's really about what's the social and cultural context. So I took a huge detour, and it wasn't really a detour, into visual culture and also science technology studies. And so Elkin's book was one of the books that I read. And yeah, um, it provided a new way of thinking about what data visualization or what a data visualization is, or an information graphic. And that was certainly one of the reasons that I expanded what I called an information graphic in the book. Yeah, I'd highly recommend it to data visualization researchers as well.
Some of the other things that to me kind of stand out about this book also is, you go back to the very beginning, and then you bring us through things like, um, there is this well-known kind of explosion of statistical graphics that did come out of Europe. But also in your cartography chapter, where you talk about maps, you do have this nicely broad set of things that, again, are not just the European examples. You've got a whole lot of things from the Islamic tradition and the Middle East. Um, and so, did you find yourself delving into sources again? How did you get beyond the usual suspects? Which books for you were the most useful in terms of diving into the non-Western cartographic traditions?
So the history of cartography, so it's a multi-volume series, and it was fantastic. It has a very broad view of what a map is. So it's deliberately broad view. So it's basically any graphical representation of spatial information. And it has been written over decades and is deliberately tried not to be too European centric. So there's a whole lot of examples of maps, or at least spatial representations from cultures all around the world. So that was my starting point. Then I also looked at science technology studies. So there's quite a lot of material there. And they are not necessarily particularly interested in diagrams or graphics, but certainly there are, they talk about them and about the manuscripts and things like that.
I was about to say that I think that I own 1 or 2 volumes of the series, of the History of Cartography series. And one of the dreams that I have is to be able to get all the other volumes, because
Yeah.
it's truly a masterpiece. I mean, that's really a masterpiece.
I,
Talking about mapping, so go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, I think we need to do something that's broader than that for, the history of graphical thinking or something like that, understood broadly, because it is a fantastic project, but we don't have any equivalent resource for a
Yeah.
broad range of graphical notations.
And I was about to say, I mean, I agree with you. I was about to say that one of the things that I like the most about your book is that it speaks very deeply about something that I've always believed, that our craft is necessarily multidisciplinary. You can approach it from tons of different perspectives, from a technical perspective, from a statistical perspective, from a sociological perspective. There are many approaches to it. Talking about that, for example, I was reminded when reading it, particularly in the chapters in which you show visual explanations or anatomical explanations, another classic, Objectivity by Lorraine Daston,
Oh, yeah,
which
yeah.
is an It's another incredible book. So I wish that more people in our field would take a look outside the classical boundaries of our field. And I think that your book helps with that. I mean, it gives people a lot of sort of like hints of where to look for more information after reading your book. So it's a gateway book in some sense.
Alberto, I'm so glad you said that. I mean, I put a lot of, I tried to not make it very academic. We don't have, there are not thousands of footnotes or things like that. But the reading at the end of the chapter, I really hope that people look at those references in those books.
Sorry to interrupt you, but that's one of the things that I enjoy the most. At the end of every chapter, you have here are some extra readings if you want to keep learning. That's
yeah,
amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not just like, here are 8 books you could read about this chapter. What I love the most is the subheadings, right? It's like, the evolution of the line chart, Haley's and other early data maps, even the history of the periodic table. Like, what I truly love about bibliographies like this is the level of annotation and the level of specificity on, if you got intrigued by this idea, hey, here's some catnip for you. And
yeah.
so I feel like this is a book just chock full of visualization catnip. You have a whole little subsection on nomograms and volvels. I'm like, my heart is going pitter pat here. So I truly, and the other thing, speaking of me geeking out, is every table of contents is a little mini taxonomy. And one of the things I particularly like about how you split things up is, right, you make these distinctions between like mapping the world and mapping the state, right? And then you go from there into, statistics and seeing the unseeable. And I feel like this distinction between what we might call, physical cartography and then thematic cartography was a lovely distinction.
Thank you. Yeah. Um,
What made you decide to go in that direction of sort of separating out those? Did you start with them together and then found, wait, actually,
yes.
this is 2 chapters worth of stuff?
Yes. Yeah. Basically, the book started out as 6 chapters, and it was considerably longer. And uh, I showed it to an editor, and they said, nah. And I knew it, deep down, but then yeah, then it actually was really natural to split mapping into those two chapters. And I agree with you. I think it actually helps think about two different purposes of maps.
And
I
I
mean,
think
the
that
other one I love is,
oops, sorry,
so go ahead.
Tamara,
No,
go ahead.
go ahead.
No, I
Oh,
was
just
about
to
to say that I was about to say that it connects actually with the literature on cartography, which makes this distinction, right? When you read any
Yeah.
intro to cartography, it begins with sort of like, let's say, locator maps, right? And or navigation maps, and then you move on into statistical maps. Statistical maps are not the only form of thematic maps, but it's the most common type of thematic map that we deal with today. Sorry, Tamara, you were going to say something.
Oh, just while I continue to geek out and enjoy about your table of contents, I love that chapter 1 is the beginning and then chapter 2 is the very beginning. And I think it recapitulates your odyssey in writing this, where you sort of started out and then you ended up going deep, deep, deep backwards, and then you come back again forwards. And that little S curve of time is one of the flourishes of the book that I feel like, almost makes it feel like we're diving into a murder mystery of like what happened way back, and then let's come back forward. And the other thing that's really interesting about your book and very unusual, and it makes sense knowing about some of your own research, is that you have this chapter at the end about visualization without vision, where you go deeply into what can you do for blind and low vision and other people for whom vision is not the kind of useful sense that it is for some of us. So tell us more about that.
Well, look, as you say, Tamara, that's the area that I work in. I I just want, okay, so why do I work in that area? One reason is because it's clearly important and it can really help people who are otherwise disadvantaged to access information that, currently they're cut off from. But it's also, as a data visualization researcher, I just find it fascinating to go, what does visualization mean if you can't see? And it it forces you to really deeply think about what visualization is, how it works, and why it's useful. And so I I feel like it's a really important chapter in the book because maybe implicitly, but it is forcing the reader to really think about, well, visualization is actually much more than just seeing. It's much more than visual graphics. It's sort of spatialization and a whole lot of other things. I was sort of inspired a little bit by Steven Pinker's The Language Instinct, uh,
Mm.
where he looks at language and, first of all, it's spoken language, but then he goes back and looks at sign language and how that provides a different way of understanding graphics. And so I was sort of trying to do the same thing.
I usually say that visual, and again, inspired by similar literature as the one that appears in your book, that visualization is not something that happens on paper, on a piece of paper or on screen. It's something that happens in the brain with the
Mm.
aid of those devices. And you touch upon a little bit of these because you mentioned, perceptual science and cognitive science in some of the chapters. Essentially, all these these visual aids do is to sort of like make a mental image emerge in your brain. If that happens through vision or through your other senses, sense of touch or whatever, it's really a little bit besides the point. The fact is that your
Sure.
brain is being aided, is being helped to understand a piece of information better.
That's right, exactly. And to think about that information.
One thing that I was going to add, by the way, is another thing that I enjoyed a lot about reading this book is how personal it feels in several sections. Is that you can see that's something that uh, Tamara and I have talked about with our other authors in the series. Something that I really like about a book is being able to see the author through the words. That doesn't mean that a book needs to be 100% personal, but I don't want books that are like fully sanitized, highly academic, very objective and very abstract overviews of a field. Those are fine. But if on top of that, you also show me a little bit of the personality of the author, where the author comes from, and how the author's experience permeate what the author is writing about, that's a plus for me. And there is a part in the book in which I essentially saw myself when you're talking about your early experience with maps when you were a child. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, yeah. Yep. So I grew up on a dairy farm, and so we had uh, maps of the dairy farm, and I read Gerald Durrell, and I was just, really wanted to turn our farm into a zoo. So I just spent hours, days drawing on the map of the farm where we're going to have the lions, where we're going to have the hyenas, where we're going to have the pelicans. And um, yeah, I always loved maps. And I also loved maps, in fantasy books, Lord of the Rings or Earthsea or whatever. Um, so yeah, I've always felt maps were incredibly important. And the other thing is I used to draw, pictures of submarines and, with how they were going to be designed and stuff like that. So
Yeah,
yeah, I'm a
cutaways
good,
of things. Yeah, right.
yeah,
You
yeah,
know how I
yeah.
got into visualization, or I believe in hindsight that one of the reasons that I got into visualization is that I was very into, and up to this day, I'm still into tabletop games,
Are you? Yeah,
including role-playing games.
yeah,
If you want to play a role-playing game, you need maps. You need to draw maps. So I remember
yeah.
myself when I was a little kid just drawing maps of things, and eventually that led or fed into the craft.
Um, Alberto, I want to go back to having that first person, a little bit of yourself in the book. I um, I actually wrote the book partly for my friends. Because they've always gone, they don't work in data visualization. What are you doing? Why do you care about these things? What is data visualization? So partly I was writing this so that they would understand why I work in this area and why I think it's important, but also why I love it. And so that I tried to put a bit of my voice into it. And I think the best science books like you do that. You've got to have it's got to be academically rigorous, but it's so much more accessible if it has a little bit of the author in there and that voice. I did writing courses and things like that because as an academic author, I've spent decades trying to remove my voice from things, and so bringing it back was, really interesting. And first drafts were terrible, but sort of slowly learning how to do that. And also, I should say, I like that you do that in your books as well.
I admit to having a little bit of the slightly more academic voice in my books, but it takes all kinds, and it even takes
Oh,
the
no, no, no.
pedantic people.
No,
It
Tamara, it's perfect for your books. It
But every
works
book
really
is
well.
its own beast, right? Every book
Yeah,
is doing
that's
its
right.
own thing. So speaking of beasts, how long did it take you to write this particular glorious beast? Was this a labor of love over how many years? Surely not
Uh,
months. Had to have been
I
years.
no, no. I said 12 years. Maybe it was a little bit more than that. Um, yeah, it was a labor of love. I hardly did it in my work time. It was weekends. I had long service leave, which is a big break. So that was when I actually finished the book. So yeah, my partner got absolutely sick of me writing this book, and my children probably got sick of me writing this book as well. Um, but yeah, it was a labor of love.
It's a pretty amazing legacy because there, again, this depth and breadth, I really don't know of anything like this. And you said you wanted a multi-volume series of like the history of graphical notation. Well, then let's call this volume zero, right? Because this
Yeah,
this this is the
will you
springboard from
write
which that
it?
could happen.
I want to read that and publish it and edit it.
I know. I mean, maybe as a community we need to do that. I mean, but it has to be so multidisciplinary. We have to bring in scholars from, yeah, science, technology studies, visual culture, a whole lot. And it would be an amazing thing to do, I think. I mean, like the history of cartography, I think that was an extraordinary project.
That's the model. If there is an editor who sort of like is knowledgeable, at least at a working level, doesn't need to be very deep level, in all these areas, in a way that they can gather a group of scholars to write chapters about each one of those things and give all those chapters a sense of cohesiveness, that will be a great contribution to the field because it will expand everybody's horizons, in my opinion.
So, Alberto, Tamara, we need to do this.
I mean, I like to think that our current book series is an attempt to
Yeah,
do that in perhaps a less top-down way and a more bottom-up way. So,
yeah.
shameless
I,
plug. We want more books. We are constantly talking to people about these. And I think there's room in the series for all kinds of flavors of books. It's researchers, it's practitioners, it's, historical, it's current, cutting edge of research, it's all the things. It's edited collections, it's single author voice, it's, one or two authors, strong shared focus. So there is this world in which if you pieced such a thing together as a collage of books, I think that's the spirit of what we're looking for in this series. So, I mean, what's interesting about your book in particular is you started it and, in fact, even finished it on your own. And then we saw it and said, this needs to be part of this series. Whereas in a lot of the other books in the series, we sort of, from their beginning, we're talking to them about those books.
yeah.
But this was something where when we saw it, we're like, okay, we're stealing this one. This must be, we need this. So it was a different pathway. And I'm glad it found its way into
Yeah, yeah,
this
me too.
umbrella.
So,
I,
oh,
I,
so go ahead, Kim.
I think that's fantastic. And it sort of sounds because I was a little unsure about whether it would fit into the series and whether it was part of your model for the series because it is, very much history and it isn't. And so it sounds like that the series is the perfect place for more books in this sort of vein.
Yes, absolutely.
I also want to ask you, have you used any of the materials of the book in your classes? Do your classes include a little bit of the history of visualization? I just want to get a sense of how you teach and what you teach.
Yeah. So look, I no longer teach data visualization, but yeah, as I was developing the material, I was, you know, I I would have liked to, but I couldn't teach a whole class, series of lectures on the history of data visualization. But I always included, at least 1 week on the history of data visualization, and uh, yeah, this totally informed that.
Yeah, I could imagine this being a resource for a lot of people who are teaching, again, to sort of expand it beyond some of the usual suspects. Um, I mean, what I wonder about, as a researcher in visualization, I looked at some of these historical artifacts, particularly the ones I hadn't seen before, and wondered, what kind of visual vocabulary could this give us, right? Like
Oh,
the Lukasa memory board used by court historians of the Luba people of Central Africa that record the history and important places for Luba king with shells and beads, and I saw this and I'm like, wow, that's a completely different visual iconography. This one, which was the Delaware indigenous folks in North America and how they specifically were
mm,
narrating things through these war marks and those maps. So, I mean, I feel like it's grist for the mill to think about other visual vocabularies. Another one that I didn't know about at all, besides the ones I already mentioned, right? You had some from um, Mesopotamian cultures that I hadn't seen
yeah.
before about their cosmologies. And so, I mean, I think a lot of people have seen things like cuneiform, but there was just this very broad set of what are ways that people have graphically depicted information. Um, and I think we benefit from that broad thinking as we come to the modern age of how can we show things in ways that do communicate in these more unfamiliar ways, right? One of the things I like about this book is it's so not tied to a particular software package, right? Like,
Mm,
these are not about what is easy to make in particular software environments. It's about what did people do with some, I mean, you do have a few chapters on modern visualization that are computer based, but it gives us this sort of rich thread to mine. And I invite a lot of people to sort of read that with this in mind. I think that, the people who do want to know about the history absolutely have a lot of fodder here, the people who care about science and technology studies, but also the people that are engaged in, designing visualization. There's a lot to grab onto here. So, you know, it fits. It
Tamara,
fits in the
I
book
think that's
series.
that's a really good thing to say. I mean, I was blown away by the ancient Chinese diagrams. And look, unfortunately, publishing, I put as many graphics in there as I could, but there are just hundreds of other wonderful graphics that I really wanted to include. And from the manuscripts, from 200
Yeah, like that one.
BC, yeah, exactly. Uh, and there are other, I didn't include any of these, but a lot of Chinese graphics where they use text and rearrange text into different graphical forms. And so it's a really tight coupling of text and form that, I don't think that I've seen in other sorts of cultures. And I found that really interesting as well.
Yeah, and also just, this is like, ancient Chinese exercises. I had never even seen this Moangdui manuscript. Like,
Yeah,
that's
I know.
pretty
Look,
astounding.
to be honest, I'd never heard of it before I started, and I stumbled on it. I just so it because it was in the history of cartography, the maps, and then I went back and started reading more about it, and I'm just going, oh my God, this is just so fantastic. This is how I've got to start that chapter, just looking at that because it's just
It's a very
I
unique piece. Yeah.
Yeah.
You could post it in a gym these days and just
yeah,
follow the
Yeah. It's
exercises.
so
Yeah.
ancient and yet so modern.
It's super ancient. Yeah.
exactly. That's right. That's what I yeah, I tried to get that across. I loved it.
Well, I hope that, I mean, this conversation has persuaded people to take a look at the book because it's certainly worth it. I mean, it's such an enjoyable read. So dense with information, so many inspiring examples. Again, as Tamara was saying before, suggesting before, I think that it is good for people in our field to get historical perspective because that can help us avoid having, thinking that we are inventing the wheel whenever we come up with a
Mm.
new way, quotation marks in there, new way of representing information. Most of the things have already been invented, and in order to contribute to the field, you need to have this awareness of what came before. So I really encourage people to take a look at it. It's really great.
Yes. Three cheers. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. And everyone leap in, dive into the glory and splendor of the golden age of data visualization. Thank you so much, Kim.
Thank you so much, Tamara. Thank you,
Thank
Alberto.
you.
It
Thank
was
you.
a
Thank you.
pleasure.
Bye-bye.